Hello there everyone, how you doing today? I hope you're all well. Today we're going into r/pro-revenge, where the revenge is everything you would want. Remember to like, subscribe, leave a comment down below and all that other stuff. Now let's get started, shall we? An attorney's dream case, my parents versus the bank. In 1973, my parents had enough money to build a little ranch house in the country. The small bank in town approved the mortgage and the bank signed a contract to give Bob the money to build the house. Bob, as it turns out, was overbooking himself all over town, leaving his clueless minions to do the actual work. The build took longer and longer, with more and more work having to be ripped out and redone. We're not talking about using the wrong color paint or nailing up some wonky trim here. The architect forgot to fully erase a line on the blueprints, and framers built a wall through the bathtub. My mother was told, "Don't put anything heavy in the kitchen cabinets," because they were attached to the drywall, not the studs, using a few roofing nails through the back of each cabinet. The garage door opening was framed into the living room instead of towards the driveway, and so on. When the bank's representative showed up to do the final inspection, my parents met him at the front yard and refused to sign off on Bob's work. The representative became angry as the bank had paid Bob a lot of money. He strode to the front door and pulled on the doorknob, whereupon the entire door, casing including, fell on him. It had simply been wedged and not nailed into place. The bank called Bob, who finally showed up to supervise the work himself. Only problem is, Bob wasn't any better at building a house than his minions were. My parents still refused to sign off on the house. My mother was a stay-at-home mom in a nasty rental with two tiny children, while my dad was working two jobs while this was going on. Throughout the entire process, the bank and Bob treated them very poorly, bullying my mom and lying to my dad. What should have been an exciting time for my parents was ruined. My mom cried a lot and my dad got depressed. Finally, the bank threatened my parents with foreclosure, and Bob threatened to sue my parents for breach of contract because the bank refused to pay him any more money. So my exhausted parents went to an attorney and gave him the rundown. Plumbing, electrical, tilling issues, the whole sorry mess. My parents were scared. All they had was their small down payment savings, so if this became a lengthy court battle, the bank and Bob would win. The attorney, Tom, was kind, but my dad said he could tell that he and Mom were doomed from Tom's facial expressions as he sorted through the paperwork. Then abruptly, Tom smiled. "Let's get everyone together for a meeting," he told my parents, "tomorrow." So my parents, Tom, the bank's representative, the bank's attorney, Bob, and Bob's attorney met at the bank. Tom didn't give anyone else time to begin. He said, "Well, my clients have decided they no longer want this house. Please remove it." Everyone else starts to laugh. "Remove it? Have you lost your mind?" Tom, in a sweeping, theatrical gesture, placed a deed on the table. My clients own the land the house is sitting on outright. They no longer want the house. Get the house off my client's land. Bob's attorney stared at the deed, and then turned and stared at Bob. "You built a house on land you don't own?" And Bob just meekly nodded. The bank's attorney started yelling at the bank's representative. "You didn't finance the land the house is on?" The representative stammered, No." Tom said firmly, "As I said, gentlemen, you're trespassing on my client's land. I expect the house to be removed and the land returned to its original state at once." My dad said he'll remember the blank looks on everyone's side of the table, passed to another one for his whole life. Sure, the bank could foreclose on a house that wouldn't exist by the end of the week, with no way to recoup the money. They didn't even own the land it was on. Bob was out the 50% he'd paid out of pocket, plus he was on the hook for tearing down a house and removing it. On top of that, the bank would undoubtedly want him to repay the initial 50% they'd given him. Could they have gone after my parents? Sure, a foreclosure would have meant bad credit for my parents moving forward. They might lose their down payment, but to sign off on the house in the condition at the time would have meant thousands and thousands of dollars in cash to replace and repair everything from the roof to the basement before the house could be safely lived in. The bank knew my parents didn't have that kind of money. They're the ones that approved the mortgage. Suddenly, my parents were good people, and it was all such a misunderstanding. And the bank and Bob couldn't do enough for them. The house was bought in line with the original blueprints and specifications immediately, at no extra cost to my parents, but at considerable cost to Bob, mind you. My parents signed the mortgage, Bob got the rest of his money and just about broke even on the build, and the bank's representative was fired. And Tom, attorney extraordinaire, got a stinging tale of triumph to recall to fellow attorneys for the rest of his life. I absolutely love this story. You did a wonderful job. Anyway, on to the next story. Steal furniture? Well, you're gonna almost lose your job. So, my dad owns a house that he's been waiting for some time now. The tenants that lived there were, for the most part, decent people who thought my dad was trustworthy. That all changed about 2 months into the tenancy when the tenant refused to pay the month's rent. My dad showed some leniency and gave them another month to pay up what was owed. They didn't pay a thing. By this time, my dad, frustrated by the whole situation and being 2 months out of rent money, offered them a deal. Leave the house as soon as possible and then only pay half the money they owed. They countered with a different agreement. They would leave the house in a clean state with all of the furniture left behind as compensation. My dad, wanting to be just done with them, agreed. Cue to when my dad gets the house, finding the place is a mess with none of the furniture left behind, including the furniture that belonged to my dad in the first place. The 2 sofas that my dad owned were left behind, but they were trashed and left in the shed. When my dad confronted them, asking for them to pay up the full amount the furniture was worth, he was met with the promise of payment after 2 weeks, which he didn't believe. And when he requested they pay earlier, he was met with good luck getting your money, followed by laughing emojis. This made my dad angry, and he was not going to let this slide. My dad knew the tenant was a Christian pastor of a church, and his son also had some job related to the church. My dad contacted the church and explained everything from how they hadn't paid him rent money to stealing his furniture and trashing the place. The church was somewhat interested about this behavior. The next day, my dad gets an angry phone call from the tenant's son, cursing at him and asking him what he thought he was doing contacting the church, saying he was being unfair. My dad hung up on him, only for him to attempt to ring 10 times after he hung up. From what we could piece together, the church told the pastor that if he didn't settle things with my dad, him and his son would lose their jobs. My dad received the full amount for the furniture that same day and agreed to back off. My dad later said it was never about the money, but the way this guy treated him and his values. My dad, being a Christian himself, was very disappointed. A lawyer's pro-revenge on a landlord. Landlords are assholes, generally speaking. Everyone knows that. But if you think residential landlords are bad, they're nothing compared to the commercial landlords. Landlords of commercial buildings are some of the cruelest, nastiest people I've ever come across. This legend tale is about a commercial landlord and how I dealt with him. Back in the 90s, sometimes I'd go for lunch at this restaurant in the basement of our building. The place was called The Vault because it had a massive bank vault that had always been there, dating back to the days before the place was turned into a restaurant. The vault was so huge that they could seat a couple of tables in there and you could eat dinner surrounded by rows of old, gleaming safe deposit boxes. One day I was there for lunch and the owner took me aside. "The landlord's driving me nuts," he said. "The landlord drives everyone nuts," I said. I was a subtenant in the same building, sharing space with an older lawyer, Aaron, and the landlord was always causing trouble. I'd already had a few run-ins with him, and we hated each other on sight. In most jurisdictions, commercial landlords don't need court orders to get you out if you're late with rent. Instead, they just change the locks, and you find out about it when you show up and your key doesn't work. Every time our landlord had a dispute with anyone, which was often, he'd always threaten to change the locks. He keeps demanding all this stuff for extra rent, the vault's owner said, and it's really weird because it's really old. The restaurant owner showed me a letter from the landlord had served him earlier that day. I looked over the demand and read a list of expenses for snow removal and parking lot repair and common area flooring and all kinds of crap going back years. I read it all the way to the end, and there it was. The usual clause saying he was going to change the locks if the tenant didn't pay this and do that. From the wording of the demand, it looks like you've been fighting a while. Why did you wait before consulting a lawyer? I asked one of the lawyers I know, and he said it's hopeless. He told me the lawyer's name. It was a guy I knew with a shitty real estate practice who'd resorted to taking little legal aid cases to keep the lights on when the market tanked in '89. You do something to make the landlord hate you, I asked? Because this is a bit over the top, even for our asshole landlord. He knows I'm moving the restaurant. I think he's trying to grab as much money as possible before I go. Plus, he's giving me grief over the vault. He won't let you take it with you? Are you kidding? It weighs almost 100 tons and I don't need it. But the lease says I have to remove it and that I also have to restore the building to what it was before there was a vault. That would cost a fortune. That asshole landlord says if I leave the vault behind when I move, he'll sue. Send your lease up to my office and let me look it over, I said. I finished my lunch, and when I got back to my office, the lease was waiting for me. It was just as bad as the restaurant owner said. The lease was a renewal of an assignment of a renewal. The original documents dating back to shortly after World War II when a bank first leased the place, and the vault was installed. Somehow the landlord had suckered the restaurant into taking over a lease that left him liable to remove a bank vault at the end of the term. No big deal, I thought. The restaurant can default and all the landlord can do is sue a shell company. But when I got to the last page of the lease, there was a guarantee clause. The restaurant owner had personally guaranteed the lease, and he was on the hook for removing a vault weighing 100 tons and then fixing the place up. It would cost a fortune. The case was hopeless, of course, that was obvious right away. But then I thought about the asshole landlord with his demands, and his threats, and his rent hikes, and I asked my brain to do me a solid, which it promptly did. It picked up the phone and called the restaurant owner. I'm fucked, right? He said. You're calling me to say there's no way out. That's what my commercial lawyer already said, but I just thought I'd ask. I can save you, but it's gonna cost. How much? 5,000 in legals and another G note for the agent. Agent? What kind of agent? Real estate. Send up a check certified and leave the rest to me. The check hit my desk in less than an hour. I went to Aaron's office. I need a real estate agent, I said. You buying a house? Nope. Selling a house? Nope. By this point, I'd been sharing space with Aaron for almost 5 years and he knew me pretty well. You pulling one of your stunts again? He asked. Yep, but nothing that'll get you into trouble. I know a guy, he said. Aaron knew all kinds of guys, and that one's one of the reasons that he eventually got disbarred. But he knew a guy, and he gave me the agent's name and number. And the next day I paid the agent a visit. I told him what I needed, and we agreed to the terms. I gave him some papers and the cash for his fee. A few days later, I was at the vault for lunch, and the owner saw me walk in and greeted me himself. The landlord's here, he said. Why? For lunch and to be an asshole. Let's sit in the vault room so I don't have to look at his face. He took me to the vault room, and with the door almost completely closed, we had a consultation while we ate pasta and drank red wine. We're making a demand on the landlord, I said, between bites of a perfect carbonara. Demand? What are we demanding? I pulled a document out of my briefcase and passed it to him while I sipped my wine. We're demanding that the asshole landlord release all the restaurant equipment, all the fixtures, the oven, the freezers, the ventilation, everything you need to run a restaurant. The lease exempts all that stuff, the restaurant guy told me. He can't stop me taking what I want. The only thing that matters is the vault, and of course I don't want that. I shook my head. You need the vault, I said, and we're demanding that he release the bank vault as well. We're insisting that he let you take it out within several business days. You think you can beat the landlord with reverse psychology? You think if you treat him like a 2-year-old, you can manipulate him into doing what you want? We'll find out soon enough. He's had the demand for a couple of days now. The restaurant owner dropped his wine glass and it shattered on the marble floor. You already gave it to him? The restaurant owner said. He got up, swung open the vault door, and called for the waiter to clean up the mess. Let's see what the landlord has to say, I told him, and we walked over to the landlord's table. The landlord was a big, beefy man with a big appetite. He sat alone, eating a rack of lamb wolfishly with his hands. My client needs an answer today, I say. The landlord looked up at me as he chewed noisily. I'm the vault's lawyer, I said. I gave you a demand the other day. My client needs an answer right now. He needs that vault for a new place, and he's got to make arrangements. Your client can forget about that bank vault, he said, wiping his massive greasy hands on his already soiled napkin. But you can't do that, I said. My shock was feigned, but the restaurant owner's jaw dropped for real. The landlord laughed at us. I'm the landlord. I could do what I want. I'm going to need that in writing, because my client might sue. I said. Sue all you like, the landlord told me. Sue till you're blue in the face. He told me that I'd have a formal response by day's end, and he told me to go away and let him finish his lunch. When the letter arrived from the landlord claiming ownership over the bank vault, I brought it downstairs and showed it to my client. How the hell did you do that? Trade secret, I said. The following month, the restaurant moved out and the place was empty, and that was too bad because I always liked eating at the vault. Now the restaurant was at a new location 20 minutes away. They called the new place the Vault, and they preserved the vibe of the old place. It was very similar, except they didn't have the bank vault. The bank vault, all 100 tons of it, were where they always had been, in the basement of the building where I rented space. I showed up for work a little after that, and Aaron collared me. The landlord's looking for you, he said. Oh yeah? What about? He's really angry, he said. He said his deal fell through. Deal? He was supposed to rent the place downstairs to a new tenant, a bank or a credit union or something like that. They were supposed to come in to sign a lease, but they didn't show up. And what's that got to do with me? I said to Aaron. And I said the same thing again to the landlord when he managed to track me down a couple of days later. I know you were behind this, he said, his jowls quivering. I know it was you. That offer from the agent, it was all bullshit. Just a trick to make me keep the vault, so that your client could sneak out of the place and leave that vault behind. I'm gonna sue. If you're looking for counsel, I think I'm gonna have to declare a conflict. I'm gonna sue the restaurant and the agent, and I'm gonna sue you. He stormed off. But the landlord did not sue. Of course he didn't. He didn't have a contract to sue on, only a vague letter of intent that I drafted, enough to hook a greedy landlord who was used to having his way. The offer he'd received was non-binding, incapable of acceptance without the signing of a formal lease, which of course never got signed. When I left Aaron's place a year later, the downstairs was still unoccupied, with a sad for rent sign sitting in the window, starting to look faded. Thank you for watching today's video. I hope you all enjoyed the stories I had for you. If you did, like, subscribe. Leave a comment down below and check out my Entitled People Story playlist. I will see you all next time. Hasta la pasta.